everybody, welcome back to this month's episode of the Build Strong podcast. We are so glad that you're with us today. You know, the purpose of this podcast is to build strong lives as we follow Jesus. So whichever age and stage of life where you find yourself, you are in the right spot. Today, I have my favorite guest who frequents this podcast, the Amber Sollie, my wife.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah, happy Valentine's Day. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to focus in on relationships. This podcast will air the day before Valentine's Day. So
Yep.
Husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, hopeful romantics. This podcast is for you.
Yes.
Because we get to talk about a number of things that we love, that we've experienced now in over 20 years of marriage.
Yeah.
And really quick, I'm going to throw you on the spot. I didn't prep you for this.
Okay.
Favorite Valentine's moment ever?
Oh my goodness. Well, there were a few that you would write maybe whatever year we were married, this many reasons why I love you.
Oh,
And so I have this red book in particular that you wrote, let's say it was 12 for our 12th year of marriage.
yeah.
That's probably my favorite.
Yeah.
But we started doing Valentine's Day sort of as a family as our kids
Got older.
joined.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're all fun.
Yeah. And some of those, as our kids got older, it's right in the middle of ski season, which
Yeah.
we love skiing as a family. And so I think
We have skied
we've
on-
spent a couple of Valentine's days
Yes,
on
we
the
have.
slopes,
Yeah.
which is not bad when you combined the woman you love, the children you love, and an activity that you love.
Yes.
There you go. So we wanted to dive in. So a couple of weeks back, we actually did a little bit of a social media poll and post.
We did.
Because we were kind of prodding people like, hey, what are the things that you want to talk about when it comes to relationships? And I know some of these things felt like they fit really good as we walk into Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
But also, you know, maybe some areas where people are thinking about or wanting to invest in or develop in the coming days. And again, if we're going to focus on building strong lives and strong relationships, it's great to kind of get a feel for what are people thinking about? What are
Yeah.
people curious about? And so we did that. We got a variety of responses.
Yeah, we did. There was one theme that was very strong. We're going to get to it.
Yeah, don't give it away
I won't
yet.
give it away.
There was a key theme over in probably
Yes.
what, 80%, 90% of the questions?
Probably 80%.
Yeah, 80% of the questions. So overwhelming
Yep.
response in that area, and we'll just leave that as a hook to keep you
That's
listening.
right.
We'll get there in a
But
moment.
here's the first question.
Yeah,
This
first
is
question.
kind of fun. What book of the Bible do you recommend newly married couples read together? So this is someone who's engaged,
Okay.
very exciting, planning for marriage.
Yeah.
What should they read?
Book should they read? Well, you know my go-to response.
I think I do.
What do you think my go-to response is?
Song of Solomon.
Why would you say that?
I just know you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that probably somewhat tongue-in-cheek, right? Song of Solomon. I don't know. This is a really great question because depending on maybe where both of you are at in your spiritual journey, where you're at in your understanding of Scripture, I might recommend different things. I know one of the things that we've done really throughout the years, we consistently read the book of Proverbs.
Yeah.
I know both of us do individually, but we'll often talk about, hey, did you notice, you know, that verse that stuck out today?
Yeah.
The great thing about the book of Proverbs, there's 31. So if you kind of overlay it on a calendar, you know, if it's the 7th of the month, you're going to read Proverbs chapter 7.
Right.
And the nice thing is, depending on your wiring, right? Because some couples, you know, they have this ideal of like, okay, we're going to sit on the couch and he's going to read the scripture out loud to me. And then we're just going to kind of unpack it together. That might be somebody's reality. Other people
Yeah.
are like, that just doesn't work for us. And maybe, you know, you're going to read Proverbs 7. I'm going to read Proverbs 7. But at some point in our day, let's talk about it. Like,
Yeah.
what stuck out to you? Was there anything that, and what I've found, I know when we've done this different times throughout the years, you'll have something highlighted that I didn't even see or notice that kind of stuck out to you.
Yeah.
That you draw attention to. What?
Yeah, that's
so
good.
so Proverbs is one idea. What else would you say?
Yeah, I would say anywhere in the New Testament you can start going through together and maybe not even focus on reading a whole chapter, but read a section and then discuss that section.
Yeah.
So it
that's good.
doesn't feel like this burdensome task, but just
Yeah.
walking through scripture together. Another thing we've used for several years, we've given countless
Oh, yeah.
devotionals
Yeah.
away. Paul Tripp has a
Yeah.
devotional called New Morning Mercies.
New Morning Mercies. Yeah.
It's just like one page. You can read that together. It
Yeah.
has some scripture to reference.
Yep.
So that's a great
Yeah.
tool.
What I love about Paul Tripp, number one, super like Jesus-centered, gospel-focused,
Yeah.
but he begins every day with like this almost like sticky statement. You know,
Mhm.
there's like this lead-in kind of line, and then he unpacks it, and
Yeah.
then there's like a scripture for like further reflection. But yeah, that's been like a go-to. We've given I wonder how many books we've given away.
So many.
Like so many throughout the years. But that would be a great resource I would recommend, whether you're a newly married couple or you've been married for a few decades. If you've never walked through that together,
Yeah.
I think that should be like a goal for you this next year.
Yeah.
Read through New Morning Mercies. Just get in
Yeah.
that habit of daily. Okay, daily we want to invest in our relationship, but the health or the success of our relationship is directly going to be connected to our spiritual health.
Yeah.
And so the more that we can invest in who we are in Christ, the easier it is for me to begin to live selflessly, try to serve as Christ serves me and serving you in that way. And so I think
Yeah.
that's a great thought.
Yeah.
So
good. Good
yeah.
Valentine's gift.
Yeah, good. Hey, thank you, Amazon. Maybe
Yeah.
you can get it overnight.
One day.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. All right.
Yeah.
What was another question that
Okay,
came
another
in?
question. How do you keep the spark alive?
How do you keep the spark alive?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mhm.
That's a good question.
That's a good question.
Because with each season, sometimes there's more demands, there's more pressure,
Mhm.
work schedules change, addition of kids to the family adds new dynamics, new responsibilities. And so how do you keep the spark alive? I'm fascinated to hear what your thought is on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, here's what first comes to mind is really focusing on gratitude versus comparison. So I think one killer of the spark would be comparison.
Yeah.
So comparing what I have, what my spouse has versus what I see on social media or other people.
Yep.
So not falling into the comparison trap would
That's
be
really good.
huge.
Yeah.
And focusing on gratitude, as simple as it sounds, as cliche as it sounds, if you truly thank the Lord every morning for your spouse and for qualities about your spouse,
Yeah.
I think that helps.
Yeah.
Okay, what about you?
That's
Man's perspective.
I love what you said, even though it sounds cliche, because what I continue to find the older and older that I get, it's often the simple things, even though they're simple,
Mm-hmm.
they're not easy,
Yeah.
right? Because it's easier to want your own way, want this, want that, So keeping the spark alive, in addition to what you shared there, so gratitude, being thankful. I would say invest. So not just the feeling, you kind of talked about the internal side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say like be willing to invest toward keeping that spark alive. So for example, I know you often will say to me, when I'm helping like do the dishes or something, you will look at me and go, "You're never sexier than when you're doing the dishes."
Yes.
And I'm like, hey girl, you know what's up, I think making those investments
Yeah.
are critical, because a lot of times I think it's easy to default in our relationships. We want to draw from what we're unwilling to invest in. And so if the spark feels
Yeah.
like it's faded,
Mm-hmm.
you got to ask yourself, where have we been investing? Like where are we putting our time, our energy? Because if you're
Right.
just giving each other your leftovers,
Mm-hmm.
and if all your leftovers is like you running on fumes,
Yeah.
you got to figure out, how do I save a pocket of energy
Mm.
for my spouse? how do I save a little bit of anticipation, excitement for them, and so it's that gratitude thing, but it's also the investment side. And I would say just like keep it fun. Remember what you enjoyed doing when you were just first started dating. Like, I remember how much fun like a walk was with you. And the busier life gets, it's like, well, we don't have time for a walk. And it's so easy to just default to, we're tired, let's sit on the couch, let's watch a football game. But the things that drove that excitement, that passion in the beginning, keep cultivating and stirring and investing in those areas.
Yeah, so good.
I think those are some good ways to keep the spark alive.
Yeah,
yeah,
I agree.
Yeah. Are we ready to pivot now? Is it time for the big reveal? So the number one overarching theme, 80% of the questions that came in via social media all boiled into this broader category. Ladies and gentlemen, drum roll. It was what?
It was communication.
Communication. Now, not shocking, right? But it's always interesting. Anytime we've done this type of, whether it's when we've been teaching in a live environment and we do Q&A with couples, or whether it's via social media, the number one thing that always shows up is communication.
Yeah.
How do we work on our communication? How do we get better in our communication? How do we show up intentionally in our communication?
Yeah.
So there's a number of questions that we kind of boiled down and kind of categorized within this bigger heading. But here's the good news. If you feel like you're struggling in your communication, you're not alone.
Right.
What I would say out the gate is communication is a lifelong journey that you have to be willing to invest in, grow in, and show up and not be passive in, but be active in. So if you're frustrated with the level of communication with your spouse right now, and you're thinking if they would just, you need to do a timeout and say, okay, how can I be a part of the solution and where I want us to get to in our communication? Yeah. But I'll stop monologuing. There were some questions that came in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first is how do we communicate better? That simple. There's others that go along with that. Yeah. So I think you open the door. Sure. So here's one: advice on communicating. I'm a talker and open with my emotions, and my wife is not.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do we communicate better? Is kind of the broader question, but then there was a specific with a couple
different types.
So one thing, if you're asking the question, how do we communicate better? I think you have to become a little bit more specific, because how do you know what's better? Is more time better? Is clearer expectation better? I think getting clear on what you actually want is probably the first step. So I want to feel more authentic connection in my communication. If that's what you mean by better, then you and your spouse need to work on what makes you feel connected in your communication. But let's go to this specific example. So somebody gave you this: I'm a talker and open with my emotions. My wife isn't. So my wife is more stoic, maybe more I don't want to say disengaged, maybe more passive, or not verbal, not expressive. And this is good to remember, because a lot of times opposites attract. Yep. Opposites attract. And so probably one of you is going to be more a talker. One of you might be more an internal processor. Spoiler alert, I tend to be a talker. I like to process things, not even just like in our couple communication, but even if I'm working on a message or some teaching, like I tend to come to you and I'm like, hey, can I run something by you? And I want to talk through it. So for those who, this couple who says, I'm a talker, open with my emotions, my wife isn't, I think you have to figure out, how can you draw out of her what you need? And how can you also be reminded that all communication is not verbal. Yeah. So your spouse, they might actually be communicating, but you assume, well, they're not talking, so they're not communicating. That's not that's not true.
Mhm.
There's nonverbal communication. There's, the eyes, the body language, the posture, like
Yeah.
all of those things are part of communication. What would you say to this couple who's kind of in that space of like, hey, I'm a talker, my wife isn't. How do we get better at this?
Yeah, I would say work on your question skills.
Oh, that's
So
good.
asking good questions. What is the
Yeah.
goal that you're trying to reach in this communication, this conversation? And how can I ask good questions to draw out of you what is going to
Yeah.
help you and what's going to help me?
That's really good, because I think especially for those who might not be as good as like expressing or articulating, and if your spouse is often like silent or stoic, if the conversation, if you're always talking at them but you're not drawing out, you might be part of the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're not learning how to ask good questions to pull out and gather information. And so I think that's a really good skill we've learned even in our parenting as our kids have gotten older, trying to learn how to ask better questions and not just
Yes.
make statements or assumptions. Because a lot of times, I think all of us, myself included, if people make statements at me, there's not much I can do with that, except
Right.
either get frustrated or, kind of blow it off. But if I at least am asked a question, I have a chance to think and respond. And this is important because I've noticed we have some friends in their relationship, like the husband is really quick on his toes and just like super smart. And he's just like, da, 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 da. Like not in a mean way or harsh way, but he's just like, he's quick, he's sharp.
Yeah.
And his wife isn't so much like expressive verbally that way. And so I think if we can learn to like slow down, ask questions, give space for thoughtful response, because
Yeah.
especially if you're highly verbal, you probably tend to be more fast paced. And your spouse, maybe they want to talk, they just can never get a breath in or a word in, because unless you're taking a breath, like they can't talk. So
Yeah.
that's good.
Oh, that's good.
One of the next questions: what are communication tools to diffuse arguments so both parties feel good afterwards?
Yeah. Good
There's
question.
there's so much in this question. Like there's
Yes.
so much in this question. So, can we unpack the question just for a second?
Yes.
And then
Let's do it.
So communication tools, I think that's a great visual, because communication is not just talking. There's skill sets. So
Yes.
just like if you're showing up on a construction site, if you're going to renovate a house, you need more than just a hammer. And when it comes to communication tools, like knowing when to use a hammer, knowing when to use a tape measure, knowing when to use a level, knowing when to, like, there's going to be different tools that you have to lean into. But in the midst of arguments, for both parties to feel good afterwards, it means that both couples, both individuals in the couple, that's what I was trying to say, both individuals have a shared goal in the outcome.
Yeah.
Because if you both have two different goals, and by the way, spoiler alert, if your goal is to always win the argument, one person will walk away feeling good, the other person will walk away feeling frustrated, discouraged, disappointed, angry, etc.
Yeah.
And so in order for both people to feel good in the midst of the argument and come to an outcome, we gotta define, like, what is the outcome that we're actually wanting to chase.
That's good.
Right. My favorite piece of marriage advice, anybody who's ever heard me talk about marriage has already heard me say this. You know exactly what I'm about to say, but the best marriage advice I ever got was right after we got engaged. Herman Rohde looked at me, 80-year-old senior saint, like just man of God. He looked at me, he pointed his finger in my face, and he goes, "You don't always have to be right, even when you are."
Yeah.
So like if couples in the midst of arguments, if they could just hold on to that, okay, I don't have to be right.
Yes.
We can have disagreements, but we're working towards unity. So what are some of the tools? What are the pieces of advice that you would give in the midst of answering this question?
I think the biggest one, other than not always having to be right, is to put the issue on the table.
Yes.
Talk about the issue. How do we work together to solve this issue, instead of the person. So instead of you always do this, saying, you know what, when you do this, this is the issue that comes from that. Yeah. So how do we solve that problem?
Yeah. Yeah. We talk about this a lot whenever we're meeting with like engaged couples or people who are in the midst of pre-marriage counseling or getting ready to bring lives together. As we talk about this picture of, so often in the midst of arguments, we put the other person on the table and we begin to like, you always do this, you never do this. And we often use absolute language that paints our spouse into a corner, and their only option is to be defensive. And again, once I'm defensive, it's hard for me, again, this question, both parties to feel good. If I'm defensive, the only way I'm going to feel better is if I win. Right. But if we can redefine like, okay, you're not the issue. Let's talk about this. So let's say it's been months since I've helped with the dishes. Okay. So like, Tyler, you're a slob, and that could be your response. Like, you never help out with dishes. Here I am doing this, doing that. And all of a sudden you're putting me on the table versus, hey, Tyler, can we talk about this? I need more help in this space, and doing dishes is like a big deal. How can we work together to solve this issue versus making the issue the other person? Now we're making the issue that we're tackling together. Yeah. And I think that's how we get to a place where both of us feel good with the outcome. Yeah. Yeah. Any other tools you would say?
No, I would say if you get to a point where you need help, you need a third party, then don't be scared to get it. Get marriage counseling, a trusted pastor or married couple who's been married longer than you. Yeah. So don't be afraid to do that. Yeah.
And I would just say as well, like to that point, the voices that you allow to speak into you, like make sure that their reality is something you actually want to like influence your reality. There's a lot of, people who have an internet connection and a following on social media, but just because they have a lot of people following them doesn't mean that their voice or their advice is the right advice or good advice. So I think being wise and discerning in who we allow to speak into what our expectations or realities should be is important. It is. And just, for whoever asked this question, every couple has disagreements, arguments, misunderstandings, frustrations, tensions. If you will commit to remember that God has put that person in your life to be your greatest ally. And so don't make what should be your greatest ally, your enemy. And that's where a lot of times couples face off, they get in these arguments and it's about winning or getting their way. Or, so good. What's the next question?
All right. How can you lovingly encourage your spouse without seeming critical?
Oh, this is good. This is hard.
It is. These are good questions.
Especially, so let me give maybe like a quick thought or caveat on this, especially for those of us whose love language is maybe words of encouragement. You have to remember how weighted your words are. Yeah. Because if they feel most loved through words of encouragement, and yet the words that you're bringing, you want the best, so you're trying to like lovingly challenge them or confront them, then you got to be aware, I think, of how those dynamics maybe play into this. So how can you lovingly encourage your spouse without seeming critical? I think you have to package things with celebrating the good. Yeah. Right. And so kind of going back to like, share what you're thankful for. Like, hey, I really appreciate how you do this. I think one thing that might be helpful for you to be aware of that you may know or you might not know, and make the assumption, like, I think if we can phrase things in questions is probably helpful.
Definitely.
To encourage.
Yeah. Yeah. It diffuses a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. What else would you say?
Yeah, that's good. I think asking questions, I just echo what you said, speaking about the good that there is, asking questions and having the heart truly to serve. Like the question is, how do I encourage my spouse? So if I'm encouraging you, like, how do I serve you? How can I bring out the best in you or help you become the best version of yourself?
And I would just say, like, again, communication 101. So let's say, I think asking questions is a great thing, but remember, communication is not just words. So your tone, your eye contact, your body language. Because if you're trying to encourage me and you're like, why don't you ever help do the dishes? Okay, you asked me a question. People are going to think like I literally never do the dishes, by the way. That's awesome. But you're looking at me, you're giving me eye contact, but like the tone, it's sending me mixed messages.
Absolutely.
And so many of us, we have to try to listen to ourselves and how we're coming across. Because one of the keys in communication, you can't just say, well, that's not what I meant. We have to ask the question, what did my spouse hear?
Yeah. Not
just what words did I use. What did they hear with the tone that I used, with my body language, with my eye contact, with, Yeah. Because if I'm like, and just like all disengaged physically as you're talking to me, you don't feel valued. Right. Because I might be listening, but I'm not actually listening.
Yeah.
So.
Good.
Yeah.
Yep. Good
what
stuff.
What else? Best tools for learning to communicate better. I think anything like on self-awareness. So again, kind of going back to what I just said, understanding not just the words you're using, but the tone, your body language, your eye contact. I think also timing of words matters.
Yes.
Because if I know like you've had a long day and I want to get into some like deep discussion, that might not be fair to you. Now I might be wired and like ready to go, but I have to consider my spouse and like, what are their needs in this moment? And there's certain things like it can't wait, right? We talk about this all the time. Don't go to bed angry. So what that means is sometimes there's going to be late nights of like walking through, so I think those are probably good tools.
Yeah. Good place to start.
Yeah. Continue to ask couples like for coaching, like what do they do?
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's good.
Last but not least, I'm going to ask this one to you.
All right.
How do we not only talk about our kids on dates? I absolutely loved this question.
Yeah.
So here you got someone who's like, okay, we go out on dates, so we're being intentional, investing in our relationship, but then we spend the entire night talking about our kids.
Right.
How do we actually talk about us? I think this is a brilliant question. So gold star for whoever submitted this one. But Amber, what would you say to this?
Oh my goodness. It is hard. And we've been there, right? I think of that Everyone Loves Raymond episode where they're trying not to talk about their kids. So they talk about the butter they're putting on their bread. And it's hard.
By the way, shameless plug. If you're a couple and you haven't watched Everybody Loves Raymond, it'll be like therapeutic for you. Because they do such a good job of, I think, this over caricature of like, marriage
life
dynamics, conflict. But yeah, they go out on this date and the wife's all excited because like, okay, we're going to actually have authentic connection. And she's like, okay, let's not talk about that. And so all of a sudden they have nothing to talk about.
Right.
And so they like talk about the bread, like how good the bread is. And then it's like silent. And all the other tables around them are having these like deep, meaningful, romantic conversations. And they're like, oh, the butter's good too. And then they get home and Raymond's like, he's wanting to be all like romantic and physical. And she's like, you didn't say a word to me all night long. And now you want what? Yeah. And I love the tension. So anyways, I'm going to tee that up for you.
All right.
What would be the advice for you? How do we go out on a date and not just talk about the kids?
Yeah. I think, again, it goes back to being good at asking intentional, thoughtful questions to the other person.
Yeah.
How can I help you grow? How can I help you achieve what you want to in the next few months? What's in your heart? Questions like that are not stress-inducing, hopefully. but that are working on going someplace hopeful and building one another up. I think it comes back to that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think for couples to think about even setting some goals for their year or for like the next season of their life. And then how on those dates are you checking in on like, hey, how are we doing in this area? So if you have some financial goals, like how are we doing? If you have some relational goals that you're working on, how are we doing in this area? I think having those caring check-ins of like, what's in your heart? Mm-hmm. What's God doing in your life right now? What's discouraging you? You know, what's building you up? What do I do that makes you feel loved, seen, valued? Is there anything that I'm doing right now that is not helping in that area? Mm-hmm. And I don't think you have to like avoid, like, don't bring up any of the names of the children, right? Because family dynamics, like your kids are going to come up because kids are a huge part of our lives for those of us who have children in our families. But at the same time, your marriage has to be more significant than just your children. And here's why. Those kids are going to grow up and move out. And if the only thing you ever communicate about, talk about, or spend time around is your children, what is your relationship when they're no longer at home? That's why so many empty nesters end up divorced within a few years after all the kids moved out, because they realize like, we don't have a relationship. We only had kids keeping us together. Mm-hmm. And so that's why, and I say this jokingly, but I've looked at each of my kids, and you know that because you've been standing there when I've said this. And I've looked at each one of them and I said, listen, you're going to grow up and you're going to move out. And when you do, that woman right there is still going to be in love with me. It's just reminding them, like, you don't run this household. You're important. We love you. You're valued. Like, you have a place, identity, like significance. There's nothing we wouldn't do for you, but you're not in the driver's seat.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah.
So,
good.
Yeah. I think that's important. Especially when, you know, your kids are young or maybe kind of growing up through those elementary, middle school, preteen, teenage years. Like it becomes demanding and it can be consuming. But you have to keep investing in the relationship. I think it's such a great conversation. As Valentine's Day is tomorrow, and I can authentically say, I love you more today than I've ever loved you before. And I mean that with all my heart. But it's been a journey. Yeah. You know, we have really strong days. We have days that are less than ideal, and we are always working on ourselves, and we're working on this relationship as God gives us the grace.
Yeah.
And I think that's the last thing I would maybe encourage couples with, for those who maybe you're in a rocky patch right now. And like this coming into Valentine's Day is kind of heartbreaking. Never underestimate the grace of God. Mm-hmm. God is able, if he can raise the dead, guess what? He can resurrect that marriage. He can resurrect that love. And so don't give up hope. Keep investing, keep praying, pray over your spouse. Last thought. Okay. I think it's important to pray blessing over your spouse every day.
Yeah, that's good.
And you know why?
So good.
It's hard to hold a grudge against someone if you're praying that God will bless them. Mm-hmm. It's hard for you to hang on to anger, bitterness, resentment if you're praying, God, would you bless them? And so just that encouragement, you know, as you prepare for your Valentine's Day, hopefully it's a wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks for taking a few minutes to be with myself and my wife, Amber, on this month's Build Strong podcast, the Valentine's Day edition. Listen, if you have any questions about anything you've heard on today's podcast, make sure to send us an email at podcast@lifecenter.com. Don't forget, it would really help us out if you take a moment and rate this podcast and leave a review either on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening today. And as well, you can find us on Instagram. I'm at Tyler Sollie. Amber is at Amber Sollie. And we have them. We're not necessarily living our lives on them every single day, but we'd love to connect with you when we're there from time to time. And thanks so much for listening to the Build Strong podcast. We'll see you next month.